She laughed loud enough for the whole parking lot to hear. "That's your car." Amber's voice carried across the Sunday morning air like she wanted it to, like she needed witnesses. She was standing next to Derek, one hand looped through his arm, the other gesturing toward my 2009 Camry like it was a punchline she'd been waiting years to deliver. "Baby, is that oh my God? That is sad." Derek said nothing. That was the part I kept coming back to later. Not her laugh, his silence. What neither of them knew, what I had never once mentioned at a dinner party, a church function, or a single conversation in 11 years of marriage, was that 3 miles from that parking lot, my name was on the deed of the largest black-owned auto dealership in Buckhead, Premier Auto Group, LLC, established 2019. Current valuation, $4.2 million. I had driven that Camry to the closing, parked it right outside, walked in and signed my name. I drove it home the same night and made Derek's favorite oxtail and rice, and he never asked where I'd been. Before we go any further, what time is it where you are right now? Drop your time and your country in the comments. I want to know who's here for this one. I grew up in Decatur, Georgia, in a house where the heat got cut off twice before I turned 12. My mother worked the early shift at a hotel laundry on Piedmont Road, and the late shift at a dry cleaner on Flat Shoals. She had 2 uniforms, one for each job, and she washed them by hand every night in the bathroom sink because she said the laundromat ate quarters and quarters added up. I watched her do it so many times I stopped seeing it as hardship. I started seeing it as information. You protect what keeps you standing. You do not let people see what you're building until it's already built. I carried that with me into every room I ever entered. I met Derek at a Spelman alumni mixer in 2013. He was charming in the way that men are charming when they've just gotten a promotion, and the world feels cooperative. He had a new Audi, a firm handshake, and a habit of leaning in when you talked like every word you said mattered. I was 27. I thought that lean meant something. It took me 11 years to understand it was just a reflex. We got married at Serenbe in the fall of 2014. 64 guests. White dahlias. My mother cried twice, once when I came down the aisle, and once I think for a reason she never told me. I have thought about that second round of tears more times than I can count. In the early years, Derek was the one with the visible career. Corporate finance at a mid-size firm in Midtown. He wore it well, the title, the expense account lunches, the way he'd dropped the firm's name into conversations at parties like he was placing a chess piece. I was quieter about what I did. I had been working in automotive fleet management since 2011, first as a coordinator, then as a regional accounts manager for a national group that handled commercial vehicle contracts across the Southeast. I was good at it. Numbers made sense to me the way they made sense to my mother when she counted quarters not as abstractions, but as things with weight. I never talked about work much at dinner. Derek never asked much. That was an arrangement we fell into without negotiating it, the way couples absorb each other's silences until the silences become architecture. By 2017, I'd saved enough carefully, methodically, in an account Derek didn't know existed, not out of deception, but out of a habit of self-preservation I had learned before I had words for it to begin looking at distressed dealerships. The automotive retail market in Atlanta was shifting. 3 independent lots in the Buckhead corridor had turned over in 18 months. I had relationships. I had the fleet management background. I had a broker I trusted named Calvin, who had been watching the same window I was watching. In March of 2019, I bought Premier Auto Group. I paid $1.1 million for the property, and the existing inventory assumed a manageable note, and spent the next 8 months rebuilding the operation from the staff up. I kept my fleet management job for the first year to stabilize cash flow. I went to the dealership on weekends, on lunch breaks, on the occasional Tuesday evening, when Derek thought I was at a women's networking event, which technically was not entirely false, because the women I was meeting with were my floor manager, my finance director, and my head of service. I did not tell Derek. This is the part people always stop on. They want to know why. The honest answer is layered in a way that doesn't compress into a single clean sentence. Part of it was that I had watched my mother make herself small so many times that her smallness became the water we swam in. And I had decided somewhere along the way that I would not do the same. Part of it was that Derek had a way, not cruel exactly, but consistent, of redirecting conversations about my ambitions toward conversations about his. And part of it, the part I am most honest about now, sitting in the office of a $4.2 million business with my name on the deed, was that I simply did not need his permission to become what I was becoming. I had learned that lesson from a woman who washed her work uniforms by hand at midnight, so she could show up the next morning looking like nothing had ever touched her. The Camry was my mother's car first. She bought it used in 2007 for $8,400 cash. When she passed in 2021, I couldn't bring myself to sell it. I had the engine rebuilt, the interior detailed, and I drove it to work every day. Not as a statement, just as a thing I needed to keep close. Derek thought it was a little embarrassing. He mentioned it once, something about appearances, about what people in our neighborhood might think about how a woman in my position should probably be driving something that reflected her success. I remember nodding. I remember not saying anything. I remember thinking, you don't know the first thing about my position. That Sunday in the church parking lot when Amber laughed and Derek stood silent. I was 3 weeks away from filing for divorce. I had already met with my attorney. I had already separated and documented every asset. I had already done everything that needed to be done quietly, carefully, the way my mother taught me, the way women who survive and teach their daughters, without ever calling it a lesson. Amber thought she was laughing at a car. She had no idea what was parked inside it. The first sign was a receipt. Not a dramatic discovery. No lipstick on a collar. No whispered phone call. I walked in on no confrontation in a parking garage like a scene from a movie. Just a small piece of paper, the kind that falls out of a jacket pocket when you're moving it from the bedroom chair to the closet hook because company is coming and you've asked him twice already to put it away himself. The Capitol Grill. Friday, October 14th. Table for two. $347, including tip. I stood in the bedroom doorway holding it for maybe 4 seconds. Then I folded it in half and put it in the inside pocket of my own blazer, the charcoal one I kept on the hook by my side of the door. I went back to the kitchen. I finished making the pasta. Derek came home 40 minutes later, kissed my cheek, said traffic on 400 had been a nightmare, and asked what smelled good. I told him it was the garlic. He had told me that Friday he was in Miami. A client dinner, he said. Early flight back Saturday morning. He had texted me from what he said was the hotel bar, a photo of a whiskey glass, the kind of ambient proof-of-life message that is designed to be believed without being examined. I had believed it without examining it. Until the receipt. I did not confront him that night. I did not confront him the next night, or the one after that. Instead, I started paying attention in the particular way that women pay attention when they have decided that feelings are a luxury they cannot afford right now, cataloging, cross-referencing, building a case, the way I built fleet contracts methodically without emotion, because emotion is what makes people sloppy, and I could not afford to be sloppy. October became November. I started noticing the smell first. Not perfume exactly, more like the ghost of it, something floral and synthetic that clung to the collar of his dress shirts, in a way that his own cologne, a cedar and bergamot blend he'd worn for 6 years, would not explain. I noticed it the way you notice a wrong note in a song you've heard 1,000 times, not loudly, just unmistakably. I did not say anything about the smell. I noticed the phone next. Not that he hid it. Derek was not a man who panicked easily, which in retrospect was part of the problem. He was confident in a way that looked like innocence. But the phone started going face down on the kitchen counter, started coming into the bathroom when he showered, started living on his nightstand at an angle that meant the screen faced away from my side of the bed. Small adjustments. The kind a careful man makes when he's not careful enough to make no adjustments at all. In December, he said he needed to work late 3 Thursdays in a row. The firm was closing a deal, he said. Everyone was pulling hours. I told him I understood. I made sure to say it warmly, the way a wife says it when she has no reason to doubt. And I watched his shoulders drop a half-inch when I did. That drop told me everything I needed to know about how nervous he had been before I said it. I pulled his calendar that same week. Not his phone. I didn't need his phone. Derek used a shared Google Calendar for our joint scheduling, the kind that syncs across devices, and was his idea originally back in 2016 when he said it would help us coordinate better. He had forgotten I still had access. The Thursdays showed 3 entries labeled BDD Meeting Conf Room C. Business Development. Reasonable. Except that the entry had been added the same day each week, never more than 6 hours in advance, which was not how Derek scheduled anything. Derek was a forward planner. He put dry cleaning pickups on the calendar. He did not add business development meetings the morning they happened. I noted it. I said nothing. January brought the Porsche. Derek came home one Tuesday evening in a car I'd never seen, a white Porsche Cayenne. Knew enough that it still had the dealer paper plates in the back window. He was excited in the way men get excited about cars when they want you to be excited with them. He talked about the engine, the adaptive suspension, the heads-up display. He said he'd gotten a good deal. He said he'd been thinking about it for a while. I walked around it once in the driveway, opened the passenger door. There was a faint trace of that same floral synthetic scent on the seat. I closed the door. I told him it was beautiful. I went inside and called Calvin. Calvin had been my broker since the dealership acquisition. He knew cars the way some men know scripture, with a reverence that went beyond utility. I described the Cayenne without mentioning Derek by name. I asked Calvin what a new one was running. He told me between $82,000 and $94,000 depending on trim. Derek's base salary was $118,000. Our mortgage was $4,100 a month. I knew our joint account balance to the dollar because I reconciled it every Sunday morning while he was still asleep. He had not discussed an $80,000 car purchase with me. He had not asked. He had not mentioned it was coming. He had simply arrived in it the way someone arrives in something. When they have a second source of income they are not explaining, or a second person whose approval they sought first. I said nothing about the Porsche. I made an appointment with my attorney the following Monday. Her name was Patricia Webb, and she had a corner office on Peachtree Street and a manner so calm it made you feel like everything had already been resolved. I sat across from her and laid out what I had piece by piece, the receipt, the calendar entries, the car, the smell, the silence. She listened without writing anything down until I finished, and then she picked up her pen and said, "Tell me about the assets." I told her about the assets. She wrote for a long time after that. The Whitmore Charity Gala was held every February at the Flourish event space on Piedmont Avenue. It was a fundraiser for the Whitmore Foundation College Scholarships for first-generation Black students in the metro Atlanta area. And I had been on the planning committee for 3 years. I knew the florist, the caterer, the woman who did the lighting, and the executive director's assistant, who always saved me a seat near the front because she knew I wrote the largest individual check of the evening. That year, it was $25,000. I had written it from my personal account, the one Derek did not know existed, the one that had been growing quietly since 2017, like something planted in the dark. I wore a navy wrap dress and the pearl earrings my mother left me. I drove the Camry. I valet parked it without apology. Derek said he would meet me there. He had a client thing first, he said. He would come straight from Midtown. He texted me at 7:14, running a few minutes behind. Save me a seat, and I put my phone in my clutch and went inside and found my table and talked to the women I had known for years about their children, their businesses, their plans for spring. And I did not think about Derek at all until I looked up at 7:52 and saw him walk through the door. He was not alone. Amber was wearing a gold dress that caught every light in the room. She had her hair down long and straight, and she walked the way people walk when they are aware of being looked at and have decided to perform it rather than ignore it. She was laughing at something Derek had said in the 3 steps between the door and the check-in table, and her hand was on his forearm in the particular way that is not quite professional and not quite anything else. Derek saw me before he reached the table. I watched his face do something complicated in the space of about 1 second. A flicker of recalibration, a decision made very quickly. And then he was smiling and walking toward me with the ease of a man who has practiced this exact scenario in his head and concluded he could manage it. "Hey, you look beautiful." He kissed my cheek. Cold lips. "This is Amber. She works with James Holloway's group. You remember James, the guy from the Peachtree deal last year?" Amber extended her hand. Her nails were a deep burgundy, freshly done. "I've heard so much about you," she said. Her voice was warm and confident and aimed directly at me like she had nothing to be careful about. "Have you?" I said. I shook her hand. I smiled the smile I learned from Patricia Webb, the one that gives away absolutely nothing. They sat 2 tables away. I know because I counted the chairs between us while I was pretending to look at the program. Table 7. I was at table 5. Close enough that in the quiet moments between the speeches, I could hear the register of their voices without making out the words, which was perhaps worse because it meant I spent the evening filling in the silence with my own imagination. At one point during the keynote, I glanced over without meaning to. His hand was on the back of her chair, not her shoulder. The back of her chair, which is a distinction that sounds technical until you are the wife sitting 2 tables away. And you understand immediately that the back of her chair is where his hand goes when he wants to touch her but knows he is in public. It is not a resting hand. It is a claiming hand. I had felt that same hand on my own chair back in 2013 at the mixer where we met, and I recognized it the way you recognize a song you haven't heard in years, not from the notes, but from something the notes do to your chest. I did not look again after that. The evening's program ended at 10. I said goodnight to the committee chair, picked up my clutch, and found the valet. Standing outside waiting for the Camry, I felt the February air come off Piedmont sharp and clean. And I thought about my mother, about the way she used to say that the most important thing a woman can do when she is hurt is make sure the hurt goes somewhere useful. She said anger was like water. It was either running towards something or pooling up and rotting where it stood. I had somewhere to send it. I had already been sending it there for months. The Camry came around, and I tipped the valet a 20 and drove home on surface streets with the heat on low and a Roberta Flack album playing quietly on the stereo, because that was what my mother played in the car when she needed to think. And I thought, in that particular focused way I had developed over the past several months, about what was left to do. Patricia had told me we were close. The asset documentation was nearly complete. The one remaining item was a formal appraisal of Premier Auto Group, which was scheduled for the following Thursday with a firm out of Alpharetta that did commercial property and business valuations. Once that came back, we had everything. I pulled into the driveway and sat in the car for a moment before going in. The white Porsche Cayenne was parked in Derek's spot. He had beaten me home. That meant Amber had not kept him long, or he had driven separately, or the evening had ended in a way that required a quick and tidy exit. I looked at the car for a long time. At the dealer paper plate still in the rear window. At the way the streetlight caught the hood. Then I looked at the Camry's dashboard, the small crack in the plastic near the temperature gauge that had been there since 2012 that my mother had never bothered to fix because she said it reminded her of a river on a map. And I put my hand on it for just a second before I picked up my bag and went inside. Derek was on the couch watching television. He looked relaxed. He asked if I had a good time. I told him the keynote was excellent. He said that was good. I said I was tired. I went to bed. 3 weeks later, I filed. The morning after I filed, I made Derek's coffee the way I always made it. 2 sugars, a splash of oat milk. The mug he'd had since his Morehouse days, navy blue with a small gold seal that had faded to almost nothing from years of washing. I set it on the counter at 6:47, the same time I always set it, and I went to my side of the closet and got dressed for work. And said good morning when he came downstairs and asked him if he'd remembered to schedule the HVAC service because the filter was overdue. He said he'd take care of it. I said thank you. That was a Tuesday in late February. Patricia had filed the petition the previous afternoon at the Fulton County Courthouse. Derek hadn't been served yet. That would come later in a way, and at a time I had thought about carefully. In the meantime, I was living inside a marriage that had already legally begun to end, moving through the rooms of our house like nothing had shifted, because nothing on the surface had shifted, and because I had learned a very long time ago that the most dangerous thing you can do when you are preparing for something is let the other person know you are preparing. My mother called it keeping your cards face down. I called it going to work. Patricia had advised me to maintain normal patterns of behavior throughout the process. Do not move out. Do not create conflict. Do not give him reason to accelerate his own preparations or consult an attorney before the service was complete. I had followed every instruction with the same precision I brought to a dealership quarterly review. I showed up. I was present. I gave him nothing to read. The harder discipline was internal. There were evenings when Derek sat across from me at dinner talking about his day, a meeting that ran long, a colleague who had annoyed him a restaurant he wanted to try in West Midtown. And I would watch his mouth moving and feel something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but lived in the same neighborhood as both. 11 years is not nothing. Even when it becomes something you have to leave, it is not nothing. And I want to be honest about that, because the story is not clean in the way that stories about betrayal are sometimes told, where the wronged person feels only righteous and resolved, and never sits in a quiet kitchen at 9 in the evening, wondering where exactly the thing went wrong. I sat in that kitchen. I had those evenings. And then I went to bed and woke up the next morning and made the coffee and kept moving. The business appraisal came back on a Thursday. The firm out of Alpharetta sent the report as a PDF attachment at 11:23 in the morning. I was in the showroom when my phone buzzed, standing near the service bay entrance, watching my floor manager walk a customer through a certified pre-owned Acura MDX. And I excused myself to my office and opened the attachment and read the executive summary twice. Appraised value, $4.7 million. The number had grown since my own internal estimate. Inventory levels, the new service contract I'd signed with a fleet company in December, the real estate appreciation on the Buckhead lot Calvin had been telling me for 6 months, that I was undervaluing what I had built, and it turned out Calvin was right. I forwarded the report to Patricia with a single line. We have everything. She replied, in 11 minutes, I'll make the call to schedule service. I put my phone face down on the desk and looked out the glass partition at the showroom floor at the cars arranged under the lights at my staff. Moving with the quiet competence of people who have been well trained and well treated at the Premier Auto Group sign above the entrance that I had chosen myself the font, the color, the exact height at which it was mounted, because I had stood in the parking lot with the installation crew on a Saturday morning in October 2019 and pointed to where I wanted it until it was exactly right. I had built this. every square foot of it. Every relationship, every contract, every decision made on a lunch break, or a Saturday morning, or a Tuesday evening when Derek thought I was at a networking event. He had no idea it existed. That was not an accident. In the weeks that followed, I made several quiet moves that Patricia had outlined in our strategy sessions. I consolidated the remaining joint accounts in a way that was legally clean and documented. I had a conversation with my accountant, a methodical woman named Denise, who had done my personal taxes since 2018 and knew the full picture of my finances in the way that only a good accountant knows a client completely without judgment and with an absolute commitment to discretion. I updated the beneficiary designations on my business insurance policies. I reviewed the operating agreement for Premier Auto Group and confirmed that the ownership structure was exactly as it needed to be. I also, on a Friday afternoon in early March, called my service director and told him that if a woman named Amber ever contacted the dealership to schedule a test drive or an appointment, I wanted to know about it before she arrived. He asked if there was anything else he needed to know. I said not yet. That was the only crack in the surface. That one phone call, that one small deviation from the perfectly maintained stillness of those weeks. I allowed myself that one. Because I'd been watching Derek come home to the house we shared and eat the dinners I made and sleep in the bed I had already decided to leave, and I was human. And sometimes being human means you make one phone call to make sure that when the moment comes, you're standing in the right room. The service director called me on a Wednesday in March. He said a woman named Amber had just booked an appointment for the following Saturday at 11 a.m. She was interested in a new Cayenne. She had mentioned on the phone that she'd been in a Cayenne recently and loved how it drove. I thanked him. I told him to confirm the appointment. I told him I would be there. The Instagram story went up on a Monday night at 9:47 p.m. I know the exact time because Renee, my college roommate, my oldest friend, a woman who has never in 20 years softened a truth to protect my feelings, screenshot it and sent it to me at 9:49 with no caption, just the image. She knew I would understand what she was saying by sending it without saying anything. The photo was taken from the passenger seat of Derek's Porsche Cayenne. Amber's legs were in the foreground, crossed at the ankle heels off bare feet on the dashboard, and through the windshield you could see the blur of the highway at night, the orange glow of Atlanta streetlights smearing across the glass. She had used a filter that made everything look cinematic and warm, the kind of filter that makes ordinary moments look like they were worth documenting. The caption read, "He knows how a real woman should ride," followed by 3 emojis, a crown, a car, a flame. I looked at it for a long time, not because it hurt in the way she intended it to hurt. I was 3 weeks into a legal process that had already emotionally concluded what the paperwork was now catching up to, but because of what was visible in the upper left corner of the windshield. Hanging from the rearview mirror, slightly out of focus but unmistakable to anyone who knew what they were looking at, was a white rectangular parking card, the kind issued by commercial property management companies to authorized vehicles. The kind I had arranged for Derek's car 2 years ago when he occasionally visited me at a property I owned on the north side of Buckhead. My parking card. On a car he was driving with another woman. I put my phone down on the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment, with my hands flat on the granite and my eyes on the middle distance. And I breathed the way Patricia had told me to breathe when I felt the thing that lived between anger and grief rising up slowly from the stomach, not from the chest. Then I picked my phone back up and texted Renee. I saw it. I'm fine. Call you tomorrow. She replied with a single word, good. Renee had known about the dealership since 2020. She was the only person outside of Patricia, Denise, and Calvin who knew the full picture. She had reacted to the information the way Renee reacted to most information, with a long silence followed by a very specific question. The question had been, does Derek know I had said no? She had said, good, keep it that way. And then she had never mentioned it again, which was one of the reasons I had told her in the first place. The Cayenne story stayed up for 18 hours before Amber archived it. By then, 14 people I knew had seen it. I knew this because over the following 48 hours, 7 of them found ways to bring it to my attention, some directly, some through the particular social choreography of the concerned friend, who mentions it sideways, who says, "I just want to make sure you're okay," in a tone that means I've already formed a complete opinion about this situation, and I am waiting for you to confirm it. I told everyone I was fine. I was in the way that matters, not undamaged, but functional, oriented, clear on what I was doing and why. What I did not tell any of them was what I had noticed in the corner of that windshield. Derek came home Tuesday evening. In a mood I recognized the particular expansive energy of a man who has recently been made to feel very good about himself and has not yet come down from it. He brought takeout from a Thai place on Roswell Road, my favorite, which was either a coincidence or a performance. And I accepted it with the warmth it was designed to produce, and we ate at the kitchen table. And he talked about a meeting, and I were nice. When I asked follow-up questions, and we were to all external appearances a married couple eating pad CU on a Tuesday night. At one point, he reached across the table and touched my hand, just briefly, the way you touch someone's hand when you are feeling generous. I let him. I thought about the parking card. Wednesday morning, I called Calvin. I told him I needed a favor. I described the parking card, the serial number format, the management company logo, and asked him if he could tell me which property it corresponded to. Calvin had been in Atlanta commercial real estate long enough to know everyone who knew anyone, and within 2 hours, he called me back with an address. It was a condominium building in Brookhaven. 12 floors, underground parking. The kind of building where units ran between $400,000 and $600,000, depending on the floor and the view. Derek's salary was $118,000. Our mortgage was $4,100 a month. I called Patricia and told her what Calvin had found. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said in the measured tone she used when something was both significant and manageable, "This changes the asset conversation. We need to look at whether there are undisclosed liabilities." I said I understood. She said she would need a few days. I said I had time. I said it calmly because it was true. I had built the entire preceding 6 months around having time, around being the person in the room who had already absorbed the worst of it and come out the other side intact, who did not need to react because she had already prepared, who could sit across a kitchen table and accept Thai food from the hand of a man who had a parking card in a building she had just found out about, and feel not chaos, but a cold, clarifying certainty. The certainty was this: I had been right to build what I built the way I built it, quietly, completely, without asking permission or announcing intention. My mother had washed her uniforms at midnight so she could show up the next morning looking untouched. I had spent 11 years building a $4.7 million business in the margins of a marriage, so I could stand in the ruins of it and not need rescuing. Derek had a parking card in a building in Brookhaven. I had a dealership in Buckhead. We were not in the same position. We had never been in the same position. He simply had not known that yet. Friday of that week, Amber called Premier Auto Group. My service director picked up. He listened to what she wanted. He confirmed the Saturday appointment at 11 a.m. and took down her name and phone number and told her a senior member of the team would be available to assist her personally. After he hung up, he texted me one word: confirmed. I read it standing in my office, looking out at the showroom floor at the Premier Auto Group sign above the entrance that I had chosen myself. The font and the color and the exact height. And I felt something I did not have a clean word for. Not triumph, not satisfaction. Exactly more like the feeling of a long equation, finally balancing every variable, accounted for every number in its correct place. I texted back, "I'll be in at 9. I arrived at Premier Auto Group at 8:43 on a Saturday morning. Not 9 as I had told my service director. 8:43 because I wanted the extra time, and because I had learned a long time ago that the difference between composed and controlled is preparation, and preparation requires margin. I parked the Camry in my reserved spot at the back of the lot, the spot with my name on a small placard that the previous owner had used for himself, and that I had kept not out of ego, but out of the particular satisfaction of seeing your name in a place you built. And I sat in the car for 4 minutes before going in. The showroom was clean. My floor manager, a meticulous man named Gerald, who had been with me since year 1, had already done the morning walkthrough. The cars were positioned correctly, the lighting was set, the coffee station near the reception desk was stocked and running. Gerald knew about the appointment. He did not know the full context, only that I would be personally handling the 11 o'clock, and that I wanted the room professional and quiet when she arrived. I went to my office and closed the door and spent the first hour on actual work. Quarterly inventory review. A vendor call I'd been scheduling around. An email to Denise about the first quarter projections. I did not spend the morning rehearsing what I would say or constructing dramatic lines. That was not how I operated. And besides, I did not need to rehearse. I had been living inside this moment for months. I knew the room. I knew the inventory. I knew my own name on the deed. The only person who would be encountering something unexpected that morning was Amber. At 10:48, my phone buzzed. Gerald. She's here, early. I looked at that message for a moment. Early. Of course she was early. Amber was the kind of woman who arrived early to things she was excited about, and she was excited about this. A new Cayenne, a dealership she'd heard had the best inventory in Buckhead a Saturday that probably felt to her like a reward. I texted back, "Seat her. Water or coffee? I'll be out at 11. I spent the next 12 minutes finishing the vendor email. I did it deliberately. Not as a power move. I have never been interested in power moves, which are the province of people who need the other person to feel small. And I did not need Amber to feel small. I needed her to encounter a fact. There is a difference. A power move is performed. A fact simply exists, and you either walk into it or you don't. At exactly 11 o'clock, I stood up from my desk, smoothed my jacket, a structured charcoal blazer I wore on days when I had meetings that mattered, picked up my iPad, and walked out of my office onto the showroom floor. She was sitting in one of the reception chairs near the entrance, a small table beside her with a glass of water she hadn't touched. She was dressed well cream-colored blazer, dark jeans, the kind of casual, expensive look that takes effort to appear effortless. Her hair was the same as it had been at the gala, long and straight, falling over one shoulder. She was looking at her phone when I came through the door, and she looked up at the sound of footsteps. And in the half-second before recognition arrived on her face, I watched her expression do what expressions do when they are not yet performing, open, expectant, ready to be charmed. And then she saw me. The recognition moved through her face in a sequence I will not forget. First, the look of a woman placing a face she knows from somewhere. Then the specific recalibration of where she knows it from. Then arriving in the space of perhaps 2 seconds, the full understanding of where she was sitting and whose name was on the building she was sitting in. I watched all of it. I did not rush it. I crossed the showroom floor, extended my hand, and smiled the way Patricia Webb had taught me, without knowing she was teaching me calm, open, giving away nothing. Amber. I'm Olivia Carter. I own Premier Auto Group. A brief pause, just long enough to let the sentence land completely. I understand you're interested in a Cayenne. She shook my hand. Her grip was uncertain in a way her grip had not been at the gala. Yes, she said. I didn't realize, I didn't know that you... Can I get you a refill on that water? I nodded toward the untouched glass. She said, "No, thank you." I said, "Then let's take a look at what we have." I walked her through the inventory with the same professionalism I brought to every client interaction, because that was who I was, and because the alternative, performing something theatrical for an audience of one, was beneath what I had built. I showed her 2 Cayenne options, both in the $88,000 range. I walked her through the specs, the financing tiers, the certified pre-owned alternatives, if she wanted to consider a different price point. I answered every question she asked. I was thorough, I was knowledgeable, I was by every measurable standard excellent at my job. And Amber, to her credit, tried. She asked questions. She nodded at the right moments. She test drove the white Turbo S and came back with color in her cheeks, and said it drove exactly the way she'd hoped, which I noted with a particular internal stillness, because I knew exactly which Cayenne had given her that reference point. We returned to my office after the test drive. I set the iPad on the desk and pulled up the purchase configuration screen and asked her how she wanted to proceed. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said in a voice that was smaller than anything she'd used that morning, "How long have you owned this place?" "Since 2019 inches," I said. She nodded slowly. She was looking at the Premier Auto Group sign visible through my office window, the one above the showroom entrance, and I let her look at it because I understood what she was doing. She was recalculating, running back through whatever Derek had told her about me, or more precisely whatever he hadn't, and arriving at the particular understanding that she had been operating on a version of me that was not complete. She said, "He never mentioned this." I said no, he didn't know. She looked at me then directly for the first time since I'd walked out of my office, and in her expression was something I had not expected. Not shame exactly, more like the look of a woman who has just understood that the story she was living in was a different story than she thought. I let the silence sit for 3 seconds. Then I reached into the leather portfolio on my desk and placed a document on the table between us. Clean paper, Patricia Webb's letterhead at the top, Derek's signature on the last page, time-stamped 4 days ago, the acknowledgement of service confirming he had received the divorce petition. I said, "Would you like to move forward with the purchase? I can have financing ready in about 20 minutes. Amber looked at the document. She looked at me. She picked up her bag from the floor beside her chair. "I think I need some time," she said. "Of course," I said. "Take all the time you need." I stood when she stood. I walked her to the showroom entrance. I shook her hand again at the door. Gerald was nearby. I could feel him not looking in the particular way that people who are absolutely looking don't look. And 2 other members of my staff had found reasons to be in the vicinity of the showroom floor in the preceding 20 minutes, because word had moved through a small team the way word moves quietly and completely. Amber walked out the front door into the bright Atlanta morning. I stood at the entrance for a moment and watched her cross the parking lot. She moved quickly, her heels loud on the asphalt, her head slightly down, in the way of someone recalibrating in real time. She passed the Camry on her way out. I don't know if she recognized it. She didn't stop. She got into her car, a leased BMW 4 Series I noticed, which told its own story, and she drove away. I turned back to the showroom. Gerald was at the reception desk pretending to review something on the computer. He looked up. He said nothing. He gave me a single nod, the kind that means I saw what just happened. And I will take it to my grave. And I nodded back and went to the coffee station and poured myself a cup and stood there for a moment in my own building, in my own showroom, under my own sign. The coffee was good. Gerald always made it strong. Derek was served on a Monday morning at 7:22 a.m. I know the exact time because I was already at the dealership when it happened, sitting in my office with a cup of coffee and a vendor contract I was reviewing, and Patricia texted me the moment her process server confirmed. She sent 2 words, "It's done." I read them and set my phone face down on the desk and finished reading the contract before I allowed myself to feel anything, which was a habit I had developed over the preceding months, and which had served me well enough that I intended to keep it. What I felt when I finally let myself feel it was not what I had expected. Not relief exactly, though relief was part of it. More like the particular stillness that arrives at the end of a very long project, the moment after you've submitted the final document, locked the final door, crossed the final item off the list that has been living in the back of your mind for so long it has become part of the background noise of your days. It was the stillness of completion, of a thing fully done. Derek called me at 7:49. I let it go to voicemail. I was in a meeting at 8, and I needed to be present for it. And besides, I had already said everything I needed to say to Derek, not in words, because we had not had that conversation yet, but in paper, in Patricia's letterhead, in the time-stamped acknowledgement of service that I had placed on my desk in front of Amber 3 days earlier. The words were coming. I was not in a hurry for them. He called again at 9:15. I was still in the meeting. At 11:30, he texted, "We need to talk." I texted back, "I know. Call Patricia Webb. Her number is in the petition." That was the entirety of our direct communication for the next 11 days. What followed in those 11 days was conducted through attorneys, which was how it was supposed to go. And which was, I want to say this carefully, not a cold process, whatever it might look like from the outside. It was a structured one. Patricia was methodical and thorough. Derek's attorney, a man named Stevens, who had an office in Sandy Springs, and a reputation Patricia described as competent but conventional, responded to our filings with the predictable sequence of requests and counterproposals that Patricia had anticipated and prepared for. The first point of contention was Premier Auto Group. This was not a surprise. The moment Stevens saw the appraisal, $4.7 million, the Alpharetta firm's letterhead, every number documented. The conversation shifted from the manageable terrain of a standard marital dissolution into something larger. Stevens requested a second independent appraisal. Patricia agreed without objection because the numbers were the numbers, and a second appraisal was not going to change what the first one had established. He requested documentation of the business's founding and operating history. Patricia provided it. He requested tax records going back to the acquisition year. Patricia provided those too. What Stevens could not provide, and what became clear over the course of those 11 days, was any meaningful argument that Derek had contributed to what I had built. He had not. He had not invested in it, advised it, supported it, or known about it. The business had been founded, funded, and operated entirely by me, with my own capital during the marriage, but entirely independent of the marital estate in every documentable way. Patricia explained to me in one of our phone calls during that period that Georgia is an equitable distribution state, not a community property state, which means the court divides marital assets fairly rather than automatically splitting everything 50-50. The relevant factors include who built the asset, how it was funded, whether the other spouse contributed, and the overall circumstances of the marriage. Derek had not contributed. The funding had come entirely from my premarital savings and the income I had built independently. The business had operated without his knowledge. The documentation was complete and clean. Patricia said in her measured way, "He has very little to stand on here." What he did have was the Brookhaven condominium. Calvin's research had established what Patricia's investigators confirmed. Derek had signed a lease on a one-bedroom unit in January, 3 months before I filed, using an account Patricia identified as a secondary checking account I had not previously known existed. The account had been funded by a series of transfers from a bonus pool at his firm that he had not disclosed on our joint tax return. This was, Patricia explained, a problem for Derek that was significantly larger than the divorce itself. She recommended I let her handle the conversation with Stevens about the undisclosed account and what it implied. I said yes. Stevens called Patricia 2 days later. The call lasted 40 minutes. Patricia called me afterward and said in a tone that was professionally neutral, in a way that meant she was satisfied. Stevens would like to discuss a settlement. The settlement conference was held at Patricia's office on a Thursday afternoon in late March. I wore a gray suit and arrived 7 minutes early. Derek arrived with Stevens and looked for the first time since I had known him like a man who understood that the room he was in had been arranged by someone else, and that the arrangements were not in his favor. We sat across a conference table. Patricia had a yellow legal pad and a pen she clicked once before beginning. Stevens had a briefcase and the particular expression of an attorney who has advised his client to be cooperative. Derek looked at me once when he sat down. It was a long look, not angry, not apologetic, exactly more like the look of a man who is finally, for the first time in a very long time, actually seeing the person across the table from him. Seeing all of it. The dealership, the attorney, the years of quiet construction, the woman who had made his coffee every morning and said nothing and built something extraordinary in the margins of a life he thought he understood. I held the look without expression. Patricia opened her yellow legal pad. "Let's begin," she said. The conference lasted 3 hours and 14 minutes. I will not detail every exchange because most of it was numbers and documentation and the procedural language of legal negotiation, which is important but not the point. The point is what was agreed to when it was over. Derek retained the house which had been in both our names and carried a mortgage he could technically service on his salary, though barely. He retained the Cayenne, which had 18 months of payments remaining. He retained his retirement accounts and his employment, though Patricia had made clear in terms that required no elaboration that the undisclosed checking account and the Brookhaven lease would be a matter of record in the final decree, which Derek's firm would eventually see in the course of their standard annual compliance review. I retained Premier Auto Group entirely, without contest. I retained my personal accounts, my investment accounts, and the intellectual property rights to the Auto Group brand. I also received a cash settlement. Patricia's term was compensatory equity adjustment that reflected the disparity in disclosed versus undisclosed assets during the marriage. I will say the number once $430,000. Derek signed without a counter. We left Patricia's office in separate elevators. I did not watch him go. I stood in the lobby for a moment while Patricia's assistant brought my coat, and I looked at the building's marble floor and the late afternoon light coming through the glass doors, and I thought about my mother, about the uniforms, the quarters, the midnight, washing the things she had planted in me. So early and so deep that I had carried it through 11 years of marriage and out the other side, without ever putting it down. Then I went outside. I got in the Camry. I drove to the dealership. Gerald was still there when I arrived, which surprised me because it was after 6 on a Thursday. He looked up from his desk and saw something in my face and said without asking what had happened, "I'll make fresh coffee." I said that would be good. He made it strong the way he always did, and we sat in the showroom after hours, with the cars gleaming under the display lights, and drank it without talking much, and it was one of the best cups of coffee I have ever had. The story got out on a Wednesday. Not from me, not from Patricia, who operated with the discretion of a woman who had built a 30-year career on the understanding that silence was a professional asset. Not from Gerald, who had absorbed what he knew about the situation with the particular loyalty of someone who understood that what happens in an owner's office stays in an owner's office. It got out the way things get out in Atlanta, through the connective tissue of a social network where everyone is 3 introductions from everyone else, and information travels at the speed of a forwarded screenshot. What circulated first was not the divorce. It was Amber. I learned this from Renee, who called me on a Wednesday evening while I was in the middle of reviewing a service contract and said in the tone she reserves for information she finds both troubling and deeply satisfying. Someone talked. Amber had told a friend about the Saturday at the dealership. The friend had told 2 people. One of those people knew Derek's colleague James Holloway, through whose consulting group Derek had originally introduced Amber at the gala. James Holloway's wife, a woman named Sandra, who sat on 2 nonprofit boards and had the social memory of a federal archivist, had apparently connected the pieces the dealership. The divorce petition she'd heard rumors about the Cayenne. The church parking lot incident that 3 separate people had witnessed and discussed in the weeks since, and had drawn the complete picture with the accuracy of someone who had been paying attention long before anyone thought she was. By Thursday morning, the outline of what had happened was circulating in the particular Atlanta way, not loudly, not posted publicly, but present in the DMs and group chats and Thursday morning workout classes of a specific stratum of the city's professional black community, which is a stratum that is simultaneously large enough to matter and small enough that everyone in it knows everyone else's business within 48 hours of it becoming business. I received 11 texts between Thursday morning and Thursday evening. Some were from women I knew well. Some were from women I knew only socially. 2 were from women I'd not heard from in years, which told me something about the reach of what was moving through the network. Every message said some version of the same thing I heard. I just want you to know I'm in your corner. I thanked each one. I said I was doing well. I said I appreciated it. What I did not say, what I had no interest in performing, was triumph. Because the thing that was circulating was being understood by most of the people receiving it as a story about justice, which it was, but also as a story about a woman outmaneuvering a man, which was a frame I found reductive. What had happened was not a competition. It was a consequence. I had built something real over a long period of time, for reasons that had nothing to do with Derek or Amber or a church parking lot. The fact that the building of it had eventually served as a form of protection was not strategy in the theatrical sense. It was just what happens when a woman who grew up watching her mother count quarters decides at 27 years old that she will never be in a position where someone else's choices can erase her. The consequences for Derek began arriving the following week. The first was professional. Patricia had been correct about the compliance review. Derek's firm conducted annual disclosures in April and the undisclosed checking account. Now a matter of public record in the divorce decree was exactly the kind of asset omission that triggered their internal review process. I did not engineer this. I did not call anyone at the firm. I did not need to. The record existed. The review happened because that was how the review process worked. Derek was placed on administrative leave on a Tuesday in early April. I know this because James Holloway called my operations manager, Marcus, for an unrelated fleet contract inquiry that same week. And Marcus mentioned it to me afterward, the way people mention things when they're not sure if you know carefully watching your face. I thanked Marcus. I told him to move forward with the Holloway contract if the numbers made sense. They did. We moved forward. The second consequence was financial. The Brookhaven condominium lease had been signed in January. The rent was $3,400 a month. On a salary that was now under review and with a mortgage he had retained in the settlement, Derek's monthly fixed obligations were approaching the limit of what he could service without the bonus income that was currently frozen pending the compliance review. I did not calculate this to make myself feel better. I calculated it because numbers are how I understand situations, and understanding the situation clearly had always been more useful to me than feeling things about it. The third consequence was Amber. She had not returned to Premier Auto Group. She had not reached out to me directly. But she had, according to Sandra Holloway, who had become through the social mechanics of the situation a kind of informal correspondent on the downstream effects of everything, quietly stepped back from the circles she had entered through Derek. The consulting group events she'd been attending, the gala committee she'd been invited to join, the dinners and brunches and Saturday evening things that required the particular social capital that Derek had been lending her, and that Derek was currently not in a position to lend anyone. I did not feel satisfaction about Amber's position in the way a simpler version of this story might suggest I should. What I felt was closer to clarity. She had laughed at a car in a parking lot. She had been operating on incomplete information about me, about Derek, about the full dimensions of the situation she had chosen to insert herself into. The consequences she was experiencing were not punishments I had arranged. They were the natural result of a structure she had not understood until she was inside it, and the walls had become visible. I thought about that sometimes. About visibility, about the things we build in the dark that only reveal their true dimensions when light finally reaches them. On a Friday evening in mid-April, I drove to Decatur. I parked the Camry on the street outside the house I grew up in, sold after my mother passed a young family living in it, now a basketball hoop in the driveway that hadn't been there in my time, and I sat there for maybe 10 minutes with the engine off. I was not sad exactly. I was not performing sentiment. I was doing something I had learned to do in the preceding months, which was to let the weight of things be what they actually were, without minimizing or dramatizing, without reaching for the comfort of a narrative that was cleaner than the truth. The truth was 11 years. A man I had loved, who had become someone I didn't recognize. Or perhaps had always been someone I didn't fully see. A business I had built that was real and mine and growing. A settlement that had closed one chapter completely. A parking lot in front of a church where a woman had laughed at an old car and had not known, could not have imagined what she was laughing at. My mother had driven that car through streets like these for 14 years. I had driven it to every meeting, every signing, every early morning and late evening that had built Premier Auto Group from a distressed lot in Buckhead into a $4.7 million enterprise. I started the engine. The Camry turned over the way it always did, reliably, without drama, the rebuilt engine quiet and steady under the hood. I pulled away from the curb and drove back toward Buckhead, toward the dealership, toward the life I had built without permission or announcement. And the city opened up around me, the way Atlanta opens up at night, wide and lit and full of the particular energy of a place where people are always building something. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. It was Gerald. The text said late inventory just came in. 3 new Cayennes. You're going to want to see these. I smiled at the road ahead. I texted back, I'll be there in 20. The gala came around again in February. A full year after the night, I had sat at table 5 and watched Derek's hand on the back of Amber's chair. A full year of legal process settlement, adaptation, and the particular reconstruction that happens when you dismantle a life you built, alongside someone else, and discover in the taking apart of it that the load-bearing walls were all yours to begin with. The Whitmore Foundation's annual fundraiser. Flourish on Piedmont Avenue. White dahlias, same as always, because the executive director had used the same florist for 7 years and saw no reason to change what worked. I arrived alone. I drove the Camry. I want to be precise about this. It was not a statement. I had not thought about it as a statement when I got into the car that evening, in my red dress, a deep oxblood red I had bought in January because a woman I admired had told me once that red was the color you wear when you have decided to stop apologizing for taking up space, and drove the 40 minutes from my apartment in Buckhead to Piedmont Avenue. I drove the Camry because it was my car, and I was going somewhere, and that was the sum of the decision. But I understand that not everything needs to be intentional to be true. The Camry pulled into the valet line behind a Range Rover and a new S-Class. And the valet, a young man in his 20s, who had parked my car the previous year and every year before that, opened my door and said quietly and with complete sincerity, "Good to see you again, Miss Carter." And I tipped him $40 and walked inside. The photograph was taken by someone I did not know. A woman near the entrance who was documenting the arrivals for the Foundation's social media account. A job that required her to photograph every car and every guest with the same casual neutrality. She photographed the Camry pulling up. She photographed me stepping out. She posted it to the Foundation's Instagram that same evening with a simple caption describing the event. What she could not have anticipated was that Sandra Holloway, who followed the Foundation's account, would share it to her own story with the single addition of the words she pulled up in the Camry. Unbothered. By midnight, it had been reshared 400 times. By Sunday morning, 40,000. I did not see the post until Sunday. I was at the dealership by 7:30 working through a backlog of service department approvals I'd been deferring all week. And Renee called me at 9 and said, "Are you aware that you're going viral?" I said I was not. She read me the caption. I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "Unbothered is accurate." Renee laughed a real laugh, the kind she reserves for moments she finds genuinely delightful, and said, "Olivia, baby, you have to look at the comments." I looked at the comments. There were thousands of them. Women mostly from Atlanta and beyond, from Chicago and Houston and Los Angeles and London and Lagos and cities I would not have thought to imagine. They were writing about their own cars and their own silences and their own things, built quietly in the margins of lives that had not seen them clearly. They were writing about their mothers. They were writing about the particular exhaustion of being underestimated and the particular freedom of having outlasted it. They were writing about the Camry the way people write about symbols, when a symbol arrives at exactly the right moment and becomes a container for something they have been carrying without a name for it. I read for a long time, long enough that Gerald knocked on my office door at 10 and found me at my desk with my phone in my hand, and what must have been something visible on my face, because he stopped in the doorway and said without asking what was happening. "Good thing or complicated thing?" I said, "Both." He nodded in the way of a man who understands that most true things are both and went to make coffee. The attention brought consequences of its own. 3 journalists requested interviews that week, 2 local, 1 national. I declined all 3. I had not built Premier Auto Group on visibility, and I was not going to leverage a viral moment to perform a version of my story for an audience. If there was something true in what people were responding to, it was true without my narration. I did not need to explain the Camry to anyone. What I did do on the Monday after the gala was call the Whitmore Foundation's executive director and double my annual donation to $50,000. She was quiet for a moment when I told her the way people are quiet when a number arrives that is larger than they were expecting. And then she said with the particular warmth of someone who has spent years doing work that depends entirely on people deciding to invest in it, "Olivia, thank you." I said it was my pleasure. I meant it without reservation. The professional fallout from Derek's compliance review resolved in April. He was not terminated. The firm, Patricia told me, through the final administrative channels of our now concluded legal relationship, had opted for a formal censure and a demotion rather than outright dismissal. Partly because Derek had been with the firm for 9 years, and partly because the undisclosed account, while a compliance violation, had not involved firm funds. He was moved from senior analyst to a mid-level position with a reduced salary and no bonus pool participation for 2 years. His new salary, by Patricia's estimation based on the firm's public compensation bands, was somewhere between $78,000 and $84,000. The mortgage on the house was $4,100 a month. I did not calculate this with satisfaction. I calculated it because I could not help it, because numbers are the language I think in. And because understanding the geometry of a situation had always been more useful to me than performing a feeling about it. Derek would manage, or he would not. That was no longer a variable in any equation I was responsible for. Amber had left Atlanta by spring. This I learned not from Sandra Holloway or Renee, but from a woman on my showroom floor, a customer who had known Amber peripherally through the Holloway social circle and mentioned it in passing while we were waiting for her financing to process. Amber had taken a position in Charlotte. A fresh start, the woman said, in the tone of someone reporting information without editorial investment. I said that was reasonable and handed her the financing paperwork, and we moved on. I thought about Amber occasionally in the weeks after. Not often, and not with the weight the thought might have carried a year earlier. I thought about the gold dress at the gala, and the laugh in the parking lot, and the look on her face when I walked out of my office on that Saturday morning, the look of a woman realizing that the story she was living in was not the story she thought. I found I did not resent her in the clean way resentment usually presents itself. She had made choices as people do on the basis of what she knew and what she wanted, and the knowing had been incomplete. That was not unusual. Most people operate on incomplete information most of the time. The question is, what you do when the picture fills in. She had left. That seemed in its way like a reasonable response. What I kept returning to in the quiet hours of that spring was not Amber or Derek or the settlement or the viral moment or any of the external architecture of what had happened over the preceding year. What I kept returning to was a Tuesday evening in 2019, when I had driven the Camry to a closing in Buckhead and parked it outside and walked into a room and signed my name on a deed and driven home and made oxtail and rice and sat across a dinner table from a man who did not know what I had done that afternoon and did not ask. I had known in that moment that I was building something that would outlast the uncertainty of everything around it. I had not known exactly what form that outlasting would take. I had simply trusted the arithmetic of it, that what you build with your own hands, funded by your own resources, sustained by your own discipline, does not disappear when circumstances change. It is still there. It is exactly as large as it is. The circumstances change around it. Premier Auto Group closed its best quarter in its 6-year history that spring. Revenue up 22% from the previous year. The service department had expanded to 12 bays. We had signed a new fleet contract with a logistics company out of Smyrna that would account for 30 vehicles annually. Gerald had been promoted to general manager, a title he had earned 3 times over, and that I had been meaning to formalize for longer than I should have waited. On the Friday we announced Gerald's promotion, I took the entire staff to dinner at a restaurant in Ponce Highland that I had been meaning to try. 18 people around a long table. Good food, a lot of laughter, the particular ease of a team that has worked together long enough to have a shared language. Gerald gave a short speech that was funnier than anything I could have prepared, and I gave one that was shorter than anything anyone expected from me, which landed better for its brevity. Driving home afterward, the city was warm and open around me, the kind of Atlanta spring evening that arrives after a long winter and feels less like weather and more like permission. I turned the Camry onto Peachtree and headed north. The dashboard crack caught the streetlight for a moment, the one near the temperature gauge shaped like a river on a map that my mother had never fixed because she said it reminded her of where she was going. I put my hand on it briefly the way I always did, and then put both hands back on the wheel. There was still so much to build. It is a Tuesday evening in late May when I finally sit still long enough to understand what the last 2 years have been. Not a Friday with a glass of wine, not a Sunday with ambient music, a Tuesday, because that is when things actually happen in my life. Not on the scheduled days, not at the cinematic moments, but on ordinary Tuesdays when the work is done and the building is quiet and there is nothing between you and the truth of where you are. I am in my office at Premier Auto Group. It is 7:43 p.m. Gerald left an hour ago. The service department closed at 6. The showroom lights are still on. I leave them on after hours because I like the way the cars look under the display lighting, arranged and gleaming. And ready as if the business is always open, even when no one is in it. As if it does not need anyone present to keep existing. I have a glass of water on the desk. A contract I have been reviewing for 20 minutes without reading. Outside the glass partition, the showroom floor is empty and luminous. And mine. I put the contract down. I have been thinking about my mother lately, in a way I did not expect, not with grief, which has settled into something quieter and more manageable over the 3 years since she passed, but with a kind of retrospective attention, the way you go back over a document looking for the line that explains everything that came after. I keep finding it in small places, in the way I hold a pen when I sign something important, in the way I make coffee in the morning, the specific order of the steps, which is her order, in the way I have never once in 6 years of owning this business needed someone else in the room to tell me I was allowed to be here. She put that in me before I had a name for it. I think about the Camry, about the morning I drove it to the closing, and parked it outside and walked in, and signed my name, and how that act, unremarkable, from the outside, a woman in business clothes signing paperwork, was the culmination of every quiet decision I had made since I was a girl, watching my mother count quarters at the kitchen table. Every dollar saved before Derek knew there was anything to save. Every lunch break spent on a phone call I did not explain when I came home. Every Saturday morning at the dealership when I could have been sleeping. Every Tuesday evening when I could have been anywhere else. None of it was for him. None of it was against him. It was for this, for the thing I am sitting inside right now. This office, this building, this business, with my name on the deed, and my staff's livelihoods in its ledger, and my mother's discipline running through every decision I've made in it. The divorce is final. Has been for months. The paperwork sits in a folder in my file cabinet, not because I need to revisit it, but because I'm a woman who keeps records. And a divorce is a record like any other. Derek has, by all accounts I have received without seeking, found a way to manage his reduced circumstances. I do not know the details. I have not asked. He was not a villain in the way villains are written, calculating, aware of his own cruelty. He was something more common, and in some ways more disappointing. A man who had not looked closely enough at the person he was living beside, who had confused her silence for smallness and her patience for the absence of depth, and had made decisions accordingly. You cannot hate a man for not seeing you when you spent 11 years not showing him everything you were. That is too simple. The truth is more layered than that, and I have learned in the 2 years since the church parking lot to sit with the layers without needing to resolve them into something cleaner. Amber called the dealership once in March, not to purchase anything. Gerald took the call and told me afterward that she had asked in a voice he described as careful and slightly uncertain whether there was a chance to speak with me directly. I thought about it for 24 hours. Then I called her back. We spoke for 11 minutes. She did not apologize in the theatrical way which I respected. She said she had not understood the full picture of things, which was true. She said she was sorry for the parking lot, which I believed. I told her I appreciated her calling. I told her I hoped Charlotte was good to her. I meant both things. After I hung up, I sat at my desk and felt something lift that I had not fully noticed I was carrying. Not forgiveness in the formal sense. I'm not interested in performances of grace for their own sake, but the simpler thing underneath it, the release of a weight that had been using energy I could redirect. I redirected it into the fleet contract with the Smyrna Logistics Company, into Gerald's general manager transition, into the expansion plan Calvin and I have been developing for a second location, a service-only facility in Marietta that would be the first phase of something larger, something I've been sketching in the margins of meetings for the past 8 months, in the way I sketch everything quietly before it is ready to be said aloud. Into the scholarship. This is the thing I have not told anyone yet. Not Renee, not Gerald, not Calvin. In March, I contacted the Whitmore Foundation's executive director and asked about the process for endowing a named scholarship. She explained the requirements. I met them. The paperwork was completed 2 weeks ago. The scholarship will be awarded annually to a first-generation Black woman from Decatur, Georgia, pursuing a degree in business or finance. The selection criteria include academic performance, financial need, and an essay about a person whose example shaped their understanding of what was possible. It is named for my mother. I have not made an announcement. I will not beyond what the Foundation requires for their donor communications. It is not a story I need to tell publicly. It is a thing I needed to do in the way that the best things are things you need to do, not for the reaction, not for the record, but because the alternative, not doing it, would leave something permanently unfinished. My mother never knew I bought a dealership. She passed 8 months after the acquisition before the business was fully stabilized, before I had resolved whether to tell her or whether to wait until I could show her something worth showing. I waited too long. That is the one regret I carry with any weight, not Derek, not the 11 years, not the parking lot or the Cayenne or the settlement or any of it. Just that. I would have liked her to see this office. I would have liked to show her the sign above the showroom entrance. The font and color I chose myself, the exact height I stood in the parking lot with the installation crew on a Saturday morning to get right and watch her face do the thing her face did when something exceeded what she had allowed herself to expect. She had that expression. She deployed it rarely, which made it worth everything when it appeared. I think she would have liked Gerald. I think she would have tasted the coffee and said it was almost as good as hers, which in her language meant it was excellent. I think she would have walked the showroom floor the way she walked rooms. She was taking the measure of slowly touching nothing, seeing everything. I think she would have looked at the Camry in the parking lot and smiled in the particular way she smiled at things that had outlasted the expectations people brought to them. The water in my glass has gone warm. The contract on my desk is still unread. Through the glass partition, the showroom is still lit. The cars still arranged under the lights, the Premier Auto Group sign still visible above the entrance. I pick up the contract. I begin reading from the beginning. Outside in the parking lot, the Camry sits in its spot, my name on the placard beside it, the rebuilt engine quiet under the hood, the dashboard crack shaped like a river on a map, pointing towards somewhere my mother always seemed to know she was going. I am still going. I have barely started. A lesson worth keeping. There is a version of this story that is about revenge. I understand why people read it that way. A woman wronged a secret revealed a moment of public reckoning. It has the shape of something satisfying, and satisfaction is not nothing. But that is not the story I lived. What I lived was simpler and harder and less dramatic than revenge. I built something real. I built it quietly without announcement, without needing permission or witness, funded by discipline, and sustained by the example of a woman who washed her uniforms at midnight so she could show up the next morning looking like nothing had touched her. The dealership was not a weapon. It was never a weapon. It was a decision I made about what kind of woman I intended to be, the kind who does not wait to be seen before she begins, who does not require a witness to validate the work, who understands that the most important things you build are the ones no one can take credit for and no one can take away. What the parking lot moment taught me, and what I want to leave you with, is not that silence is power, though sometimes it is. It is that clarity is power. Knowing exactly what you are building and why, without needing to explain it, without needing the approval of the people who have underestimated you, that is the thing that does not fail when everything else shifts. The car they laughed at carried me to every signing, every meeting, every early morning that built the life they did not know I had. Keep your Camry. Keep building. Keep going. The sign above the door has your name on it. They just don't know it yet.